Hello.
Hello, Luca. So I'm here with my
It
friend Luca Rade. Is that how you say your last name?
depends where we are. Raid in the US, but Rade would be the technical
Rade.
Dutch pronunciation.
Excellent. Thank you. And we've had some astonishing conversations historically, and I'm really looking forward to just getting a little bit into each other's minds here today and some of the things that fascinate us. Um,
Yeah, same
um,
here. Thanks for having me.
oh, my pleasure. Yeah, so we're going to explore a little bit about language, humans, sociology, and maybe we'll get into some other philosophical and or spiritual topics. Um, Tell me a little bit about your history, a little bit about your childhood, your interests as a kid, how those developed into your adolescence and young adulthood.
Yeah. Well, I am from five cultures, all five of which failed to properly grasp me into themselves, and they all interfered with each other. So that gave me both the curse and the blessing of being cultureless as I entered adulthood. So that both enabled me to kind of see between the cracks and feel a bit more deeply into what was happening inside of me and around me. And I guess the freedom, which I'm increasingly appreciating, to build my own home and construct my own culture from so my dad is Dutch, from a middle class Dutch family. And my mother is Austrian from a minor aristocracy stretching back to Italy. We have paintings of very emotionless looking ancestors on the wall, looking very repressed. Uh, so there's a very strong kind of the really repressive European, the repressive strain of European culture has entered me through that. But my grandmother on my mom's side was American, so there was already some American influence there. And then there were all these interferences started happening. So my grandfather on my mom's side was a diplomat. So my mom grew up in Iran and India, and different cultures coming in. And my uncle was doing psychedelics in Goa. So there were all these things coming in already, like kind of starting to break the top down ancestral structure that otherwise would have just kept propagating. And then in me, I did my high school in Brazil. My dad was also a diplomat.
Hmm.
And a lot of my close friends were Brazilian. So there was a lot of the kind of chiller Latin culture.
Hmm.
uh, and my parents lived in the U.S. in New York for 4 years, right before I was born. And that really, my mom became a dancer there. Like she'd never really done dancing before, and by the end, she was doing choreographies. My dad also loosened up a bit. So there are all these cultures kind of intertwining, and they all tried in different ways to claim me for their own, so to say. And my behavioral body adopted pieces of each of these. But yeah, they all interfered, and it's not this that they were different, but there was like opposition. One would have a different behavioral norm from the other, and then that would play itself out like in my body and in my like literally moment to moment as I was interacting with people. And so yeah, that kind of gestated, and it didn't really kind of crystallize until I got to college and in the U.S. and America's frontier openness, so to say, uh, messed with my mind in a good way, and created the space for things to open up. And I tried psychedelics and met people who were very, you know, explorative, shall we say, of their own existences. And that's the moment when the little breakages that had happened throughout my childhood and growing up crystallized into some more permanent opening into which I could enter and become, I guess, the explorative uh, wisp amoeba thing that I am now become.
What were some of the seminal events that you remember in your teen life as you're first getting, you know, I don't know when your academic interests began or how they began, but anything significant in your life history that you feel catalyzed your concerns and your fascination for philosophical, linguistic, and spiritual matters?
Yeah, I mean, one immediately pops out, the most prominent one, which is I discovered the science fiction author Peter F. Hamilton. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Hmm. No, I haven't.
He's
I'm a
amazing.
science fiction nut, but I haven't read him.
Highly recommended. Yeah, really amazing. Even now, I still, recently read a new book of his, and it's still really, really gripped me. And that what that did to me is it was a 500-year future 500 years. Uh, and there was a timeline, a trajectory of how that future had developed from the current day. Uh, and it felt like the inevitable progression of how the world would go. Obviously now I don't feel that anymore because I've developed my thoughts. But as a teen, it totally reshaped my idea from like, all right, the world will stay pretty much as it is with some, we'll have flying cars or something. I didn't really have exposure to really grand ideas. And then when I read that, I was like, oh shit, like we would genetically engineer ourselves to become in symbiosis with the biological world around us, and traveling to space. I mean, that's obviously an obvious one, but in the particular way, the nuanced way that he was describing it in this book, and then there were also like spirits from the dead coming back and all kinds of things that, more than anything else, just uh, broke the linear thread that I had of what the future could be. That was unconsciously adopted from the world around me. And even though the trajectory that Peter of Hamilton presents is not a realistic path necessarily, uh, just having a thread that's like so sideways from the main one also opens this entire space. So that was, I had like a weekend in which I was barely sleeping, just like, oh my god, one of those kinds of weekends. Yeah.
And were you reading, what other authors influenced you, if any?
Well, a lot. There's no way I could give a comprehensive list, but just some that kind of feel adjacent, perhaps, to Peter F. Hamilton. Ayn Rand, actually, with Atlas Shrugged. Not necessarily her philosophy. Like, I don't necessarily buy into her philosophy as a whole. But Atlas Shrugged also had this kind of influence where it broke um, the institutional narratives of how reality is. Right, as humans, we're just cogs basically in this big civilizational infrastructure, and that's how it is. And there's a very top down flow of authority and legitimacy, and so that was how I grew up, and my parents and everyone around me like was unconsciously embedded in that.
Ah, yes.
And Ayn Rand helped me break that and be like, oh, we're actually, uh, well, at the time I was thinking we're human beings, and now I'm more thinking we're organisms. So it's even a layer below just human beings. We're alive organisms as we are, who are part of a civilization, but we're not dictated by the civilization. And that breakage is create the amount of space that creates is absolutely incredible. Internally, like not just in action, but also just in one's perceptual experience of the world, and how language begins to change, how social relations become like thicker and more meaningful because they themselves are the full thing rather than being part of this huge system. So yeah, all kinds of things started changing.
About what was your age then?
I think Peter F. Hamilton was around 13 that I first
Ah,
started reading it.
wow.
And then 14, 15, like more and more influences started coming in.
Um, did you have any non-ordinary experiences during your childhood or adolescence that stand out to you?
Define non-ordinary experiences.
Yeah, it can be difficult.
Or
Any
maybe
unusual, say again? Oh, sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Any unusual dreaming experiences or perhaps a significant illness, accident, or injury, or something that left you with questions about spirituality, religion, before life, after death? Any events that you recall? And like I said, these could be as simple as a very unusual dream.
Yeah, well, two dreams come to mind. One is not so much a dream, but like a recurring state during kind of pre-sleep, mm, in which I guess my proprioceptive model got super warped. So suddenly my arm would be like the size of the universe and the rest of my body like a dot, and then it would morph. It was kind of like I was like in 5D, and the three-dimensional world was like it was embedded in 5 dimensions basically. I don't
Huh.
know, really know how to describe it.
And your
Uh,
age?
I mean, I had that like kind of throughout, like it wasn't like a single event, but I guess from what I remember, it started uh definitely after 13, like probably 14 or 15, yeah, something like that.
And these are experiences that happen between being awake and being asleep, generally?
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes in dreams as well to some extent, but the in dreams they weren't as encompassing as in the awake to sleep. It's not like I could still feel my leg and also feel that my leg had changed proportions. It's like my actual leg had was changed in proportions. Like I didn't have a normal sense of my body left except this weird warping. And
Wow.
actually I think that's one of the reasons that topology really gripped me, and that was the area in math that I developed the most in when I was in college,
Hmm.
because that's very much you're shifting dimensions in beyond 3 dimensions. You're shifting in all kinds of dimensions, different spatial systems. So I think the connection there is, and not just topology, also just general uh, thinking about the world, of which topology is maybe the foundation in some sense.
Yes, this is a central topic for me because I think most of us are pretty deeply scripted to generalize or take what I call the worst common denominator when we're thinking about a topic, or anything from film to people in general to some cohort of people. Often we can make some very clumsy generalizations, and I always like to remember that humans are a topology. I may want to point out something about the valleys, but there's always going to be mountains too, right? Regardless of whether we place the value on the valleys, whether we say the low terrain is good or the high terrain is good, right? Either way.
Yeah. And then even within, if let's say you're on the peak and you're talking about it, even within there, the when you zoom in, it starts
Yes.
getting weird. Oh, like it's
Yeah,
not just
absolutely.
all these weird shapes start happening, which is a very theoretical way of putting it. But practically, it just means if you look at a thing, the more you look at it and the deeper you get into looking at it, and the kind of broader your perceptual state as you look at it, the more it starts getting confusing, basically.
Do you
Everything
mean
you're
that
projecting onto it starts kind of dissolving. And in the confusion is a different kind of clarity, but it feels different.
huh, I follow, I think. So like it sounds like you're saying something like, as you behold something in your vision, when you begin to pay very close attention to it, it changes. What you see changes. The scope of your vision changes. What details emerge that you can sense can change. Something like this.
Yeah,
Am I
exactly.
with
And
you?
that last thing is key, is that also your whole perception, not just your vision, but also your bodily sensations and how you're reacting to that thing. You start noticing the perception of your reaction to that. And in
Mhm.
there you find all kinds of confusing surprises. And you almost like in every moment in some sense, like all of experience is, if you go deep enough, like all of experience kind of emerges from it.
It's true. Yes. Well, I think ordinarily in in casual participation, we may be kind of asleep, right?
Yeah.
And so when we start really paying attention and being present, and um, our curiosity is awakened and our passion is awakened, then it's a completely different inner landscape, relational landscape.
Yeah.
Um, so I was really quite astonished in our first conversation, and I believe you were in Portugal then?
Yeah. Still in Portugal now.
Is
Yeah.
that where you are now? Okay, great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in San Francisco. Um, I was astonished at some of the insights you had about. It's difficult to just draw a circle around the topic somehow, but it was about some of the problems that face us as moderns, humans living in this time, in the world that we're in, and also some of the perennial problems that have kind of plagued our societies, if you will. And it seemed to me that you had a very deep um, inspiration around trying to establish something, a sort of a game B situation, right? Like we're all playing game A. It's a pretty shitty game. There must be a better game we could play. And I think this is something that interests both of us. And so you seem to have some ideas about game B. But maybe before we get there, talk, if you will, a little bit about where your fascination with language comes from and what drives your passion in chasing the questions that you have around what I'd call representational cognition.
Yeah. Love that. Um, yeah. Well, with the game B, first of all, I don't like the word game B actually. I like what it's pointing to. And in theory, it's an okay name, but I think in practice, it gets us into this. It recalcifies the cognitive perspective where it's conceptual, like, oh, game A has this structure, game B has this structure, or like robots choosing a structure. So for that reason, I try to steer, and I see that happening a lot when game B is used by people talking about game B. I see this insidious effect happening a lot.
Hmm.
So I almost prefer to keep it like nameless, like just call it a different thing every time, almost to
Yes,
acknowledge that it is a nameless, non-conceptual reality, that an alternative that's non-conceptual,
I
a
follow.
way of being that's non-conceptual. Yeah,
Hmm.
intrinsically, there's still concepts inside of it, but contained within it. They're not dominating it the way that game A is dominated by the conceptual structures.
I understand
So
your reticence there, and I share it. It was just a clumsy misnomer.
yeah, I think it's okay to use occasionally as one of several names, and then keep changing the name, and then there's no issue. B. um, Game B, sorry, not Plan B. uh,
So
yeah, and the
back,
language question. Oh yeah,
yes,
sorry.
back to your fascination with language, which is something I think we deeply share.
Yes, yes,
I
and
mean, one of the things that blew my mind is that we've had very similar ideas, and it was amazing to meet another person who had clearly seen some of the things that fascinate, confuse, and thrill me, um, but from his own perspective. And so there's so much new. For me, there was so much novelty there, right? Very
yeah,
similar concerns and perspectives, but a very different sort of the person behind them and your interest in them was unique enough to make it really exciting for me. So yeah,
yeah,
let's talk a little bit about language,
yeah.
wherever you want to
I
go
just
with
want
it.
to, I just want to say vice versa with the writing. Yeah, I really appreciate also your Facebook posts. The same as you're saying, like your writing is different from mine. So when I read it, it like new things happen, but new things in the same domain in which I've already gone really deep, and that's a really rare thing for that kind of thing to happen.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
so
we agree about
really
that.
respectful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a really rich question. So let's see how I enter it. Well, language. I was just thinking maybe a week ago, actually. Maybe I'll start there. I was appreciating how I've been gifted the tool of language, um, by all kinds of the civilization I'm in, the education where I was able to learn language, all the books I had access to, all the people who wrote those books, just a lot of different things that enabled me as an organism, as a human being who could have been alive when there was no developed language, to have language as a tool, almost like a physical tool. Like I can shape my environment with it, myself with it. Um, and it does kind of feel almost physical to me. And I don't think that's even metaphorical, because it does, when you speak language, it does actually enter another person's like literal nervous system, and like it literally has physical changes, and then they'll conduct physical actions, slightly differently or very differently. So I think it is like a literally indirect, no, a literal physical thing that's just more subtle than a hammer, but it's as physical. And the same
That's
with
fun.
yourself. Yeah.
It's funny, I rarely think of it that way, but it's very clear that it is thus now that I'm seeing it that way through your eyes. Please continue.
Yeah, and also on myself. So I like write a lot of stuff, poetry, and I just general reflections, etc., like lists of things, as a lot of people do. And then reading it, like when I reread it, it actually affects me strongly. It's like, especially if it's been a while, and then I read it again. Uh, it's not just a reminder of something. It actually tangibly changes my state.
Hmm.
So yeah, in a sense, through language, like I've partially created what I am now. Partially, of course, like there's so many things that go into us that is way beyond our control. So there's no illusion here of being able to fully create myself. But there is some, pretty intense aspect of that through language uh, is enabled, and in the world around me. So yeah, I think the physical quality is the main thing that makes me treat it very gravely, and seriously, and exploratively, I guess. Yeah, it's because it has this physical quality, so to say. It's not it's not a symbolic system that's embedded in something beyond me that I am uh borrowing. I feel like this is how I maybe used to feel about language, and I sense that a lot of other people feel this way, that it's almost like a borrowed thing that is beyond us, right? There's the dictionaries and the corpus of language, which is we're borrowing and we get to use it uh, almost outside of our core selves. And yeah, so I don't know exactly what sparked it. I guess I have some ideas of the key events, but over time, I've come to own language as I use it, as a physical tool that is like a hammer created by a blacksmith. Maybe, it's definitely not something I've generated, but it is a thing that I now have, and can change and use in new ways, in different ways that maybe go way beyond what the language was originally created for. So that I
You,
think that pretty much gets at the core of it.
do you get the sense that I guess there's many different ways that we can think about language in general and specific features of language, but I think I was fascinated by language primarily through my exposure to science fiction. Right? So I
Mm.
was reading science fiction
Yeah.
from the time I was about 6.
Mm.
And by the time I was a teenager, I'd probably read a couple hundred books.
Damn.
Um, and almost all of it sci-fi. Right. So I was just starving for that particular. I loved the prophetic sort
Mm.
of
Yeah.
minds of the science fiction authors, and I
Yeah.
was profoundly confused about how they could have formed such minds. Like it occurred to me that this is the kind of mind I would like to have, but I can't imagine ever having it. Um, as I began writing poetry in my late teens, it would be a while yet before I become sort of more technically interested in language and linguistics and semantics. Um, but probably in my early 20s, I began to, in my writing, have a very unusual relationship with it, in the sense that I sort of became a wild experimentalist, and was trying to do the strangest things I could think up to do with language and writing. Um, and the reason that I mention these things is, do you think about the metaphysical problems of why there's an animal running around on the face of this planet that's essentially a formally representational cognitive that uses things like sentences and build tools? And I mean, does this question ever bother you? Do you ever wonder? I think part of what I'm asking is, talk about your metaphysical relationship with language in any way that feels comfortable for a minute. Where does this stuff come from? Is it just humans goofing around down here? Is there something more going on? Give me the skinny.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, yeah, really important and challenging question that there's like maybe not a well, yeah, we don't have like an agreed upon answer in the world. Um, well, I think there's a lot of different directions I could go with this. You know, a lot of different thoughts and feelings about it. But a thing that recently I've been, well, maybe like probably 2, 3 years already that it's been a bit alive, and then recently it's really come more alive. Is the the feeling? So I studied ecology and evolutionary biology was my main thing during college.
Hmm.
It was math, psychology, ecology, and evolutionary biology in a trio of a self-made major. So that influences my thinking quite a bit. But the thing, as I left the kind of purely cognitive conceptual realms of university and came out into the world, and all that knowledge started meshing with actual lived reality, uh, I started noticing a feeling that's only increased since then, that there's what I call like a colonizing society that is an organism that we're hosts of, like the way that we're also hosts to viruses. And because we're so intensely social, there's space in that sociality for like an actual other organisms to exist that
Mm-hmm.
are maybe not quite as cohesive and coherent as a human being is. But then again, a human ourselves are also getting replaced, you know, all the time. So we're not actually that cohesive either in some sense. Uh, but it's probably still less cohesive than that. But nevertheless, it does have a real coherence that can be evolutionarily selected upon, I would say. And there's various different theories on this, but it's not really it hasn't really developed enough for there to be a scientific consensus on it. Um, but a lot of theories in that direction, and it's kind of like post-human. So humans were the apex predators for a while, and we still kind of are. But now there's this colonizing society, which happened to emerge in Europe, but it could have emerged in other places. Um, and which it's obviously we all know about external colonization of other planets, but it's also internally colonizing of
It
organisms,
is. Yes.
very strongly so.
Yes.
uh, and it kind of eats up the lives of us as our organisms, and doesn't replace, but yeah, like sits on top of those lives and converts them into its own existence.
Mm-hmm.
And there's if you watch videos of like parasitic organisms like wasps being parasitized and caterpillars and stuff, you can get like this really vivid visual image, like if you just YouTube it, which of course it's not as intense for us, like we still have more, we're not just dead with things coming out of us, but there is a very strong, I would say, like literal parallel between that, and language is really interesting in that regard, because it's both part of that colonization. Through language is how a ton of that colonization happens. Like without language, I don't think this colonizing society organism would exist. But at the same time, it's I mean, a liberatory tool, you could say. That's a bit of a cliche term to use, I guess. But we can also, through it, create communication channels between each other as humans that subvert that organism, right? That colonizing society organism, and create like a resonant space together where we can create something new. Not something new, something where our values as individual human beings are what are defining how we're existing together, rather than this top down colonization wiping out our own internal lives and what we actually care about. It's kind of, yeah, from our internal lives that our collective being is determined on, I'm both on a small scale, two people, groups, and to some extent society, but it has to start on a smaller scale, I would say. Yeah.
Yes, we agree. So I remember when I first began to think about related topics, uh, I came up with some language, and I was surprised to see that you had a very similar perspective with your own ways of speaking about it. So the three concepts were that the human minds form a network, something like a network, right? They're connected, and they have physical and non-physical parts of the network, right? The internet is sort of a physical part, but people dreaming at night in the same house is a non-physical part, or maybe even on the same continent. So that network I called the cognitium. The connecting elements in the network I call the mimula. There's physical mimula and non-physical mimula. But then something lives in the mimula. And the thing that lives in the mimula is the colonizing force, which I call thrisps. And
Right.
they're
Yes, sir.
basically just ideas. I mean, in the simplest sense. There's many ways we could talk about them and give examples of them, but the religions are thrisps, the corporations are thrisps, the governments. Even if the religions have some sort of core a trustworthy metaphysical, feature, they're still highly colonizing, right? They're weaponized. The surface layer of the religions is highly weaponized.
Yeah.
It's weaponized for the sake of conversion.
Oh, what?
And
Sorry. Emerge.
conversion, right? The
Convert. Yes. Yes.
religions, yeah,
Yeah.
religions, because they're proselytizing and so on. So
Mm.
I see the same kind of problem, and it looks like a really deadly problem to me. What happens over time is that key features of our potential for insight, um, group behavior, communal behavior, learning, self-fulfillment, and all of these kinds of things, they get pretty severely compromised by the load that we're carrying from
Mm.
society, history, culture, tradition, commerce, war, all of these things. And the thrisps are highly aggressive, and basically they compete for dominance in the mimula and for reproduction in humans. Those are sort of the simple resources that they are most interested in. I'm not sure that I think of them as organisms, but they can be evolutionarily selected. This is the problem, so that they become more adept at compromising humans and also sort of putting the humans to work on their behalf, which is really bizarre because it starts to look like a metaphysical problem at this point, because something has captured the humans, and it isn't the humans, it's something in the humans, right? In their ways of thinking and behaving and relating that's structured, right? You can point it out. You can say that you can sort of dissect it and say like, okay, here's the human over here, and this is the crap they're carrying, So it's a really bizarre situation. And I was startled that you seem to be aware of something very similar. I don't now look, I don't sit around obsessing about this. I study it because I'm interested in understanding if it's possible to introduce something medicinal, right? Something that would liberate us from this problem. And I think even having the idea that it exists is the beginning of something medicinal. Because if you don't see that it exists, then it's fairly difficult to acquire any degree of immunity to it.
Yeah.
We've got about 4 minutes before the segment ends. So anything you want to add in the next few minutes?
Yeah, that might be the perfect amount of time for the, kind of describing my experience of this medicinal alternative, which in one word is God, but there's a lot of caveats to be said there. So I think Christianity was the beginning rather than the end of our birthing of God, and I think God is emergent rather than prior. So the way that God was conceived in Christianity and in general, like not just God but also gods in different religions, and even in most indigenous religions, as far as I'm aware, is that they exist prior to humans or above humans somehow, and they created the world and humans. Uh, but there is some kind of divine force that I feel like most people have experienced at least a very small piece of, and some people have experienced in a more substantial form. And it does seem to just keep happening, like throughout history. It seems to be a thing that is
Yes.
there,
Yes, it
kind
sure
of
does.
undeniably somehow there. Is that's the It sounds kind of weird to put it that way, but I think that's the only way to describe it. And I think Christianity was like kind of recognizing and a kind of a very hazy, confused attempt to start and also recognition that that is the power which can free us from thrips, because Christianity originally was like like a very small scale, like underground anti-Roman Empire movement.
Right.
People were living in
No, no,
houses,
in
all
a
about
way,
love. It was very different from what Christianity is now.
yeah, I mean, the religions sort of pose the same problem. In the religions, the thrips are simply the evil, right?
Yeah,
So the
yeah,
religions are there to supposed to be the medicine against the evil, right? So it's
right.
this kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah,
About
and
2 minutes.
it takes this the religion as it gets structured takes the original inspiration that of like recognizing whatever this divinity thing is, or love. I'm more and more realizing it's like somehow love, just the as a noun, not directed, but just like a feeling, a field of love that one can tap into. Uh, People that discovered that, and then it got clamped down by the religious structure that converted it into a thrisp, and kind of
Hmm.
neutered its effect as a result. And
Yes.
I just want to say about this emergent thing, because that was for me that really like changed my relation to this really profoundly. Because if it's top down, it's like, oh, you're submitting to an authority, and then it loses the whole freedom aspect, because it just becomes another top down thrisp or colonizing situation. But it's actually emergent in that it's a thing that has emerged as a maybe as a thrift, you could say. I don't know.
Okay,
You'd
hold
have to
that
tell me.
thought. Hold that
We're
thought.
running out. Okay, cool,
We're
cool.
out.
Well, we have a great jumping off point then.
Yes, so hold that thought. It's emergent. I'll send you a new link shortly.
Sounds good.